Samuel Okonkwo slammed his palm on the polished mahogany table, making the stack of crisp $100 bills jump. His voice cracked with something between rage and terror as he shoved the money back across the desk. Keep it.
Keep it.
I don't want blood on my hands. The woman sitting opposite him didn't flinch. Grace Adeyemi simply folded her hands over the rejected payment, her expression unreadable behind designer sunglasses she never seemed to remove, even indoors. The silence in her office stretched like a tightening noose. "You're making a mistake, Samuel," she said softly, almost kindly. "This money could save your business, your children's school fees, your mother's hospital bills." Samuel stood so abruptly his chair toppled backward. "I said no. Whatever you're involved in, whatever this money represents, I want no part of it." He stormed out, leaving the door swinging behind him. Grace didn't move. She simply picked up her phone and made a single call, speaking 3 words that would echo in the community for weeks to come. He said no. 5 days later, Samuel's construction company collapsed. Permits were mysteriously revoked. Suppliers withdrew contracts overnight. His bank accounts were frozen pending an investigation into fraud he didn't commit. Within 2 weeks, Samuel Okonkwo had vanished from the community entirely. Some said he fled to another state. Others whispered darker possibilities. But everyone wondered the same thing. What was wrong with her money? Grace Adeyemi had lived in the community for 7 years, and in that time she had become something of a legend. She was the woman who appeared at town hall meetings with solutions wrapped in envelopes. She was the silent benefactor who paid hospital bills for strangers, settled debts for struggling families, and funded scholarships for promising students. People praised her generosity in church services, thanked her in tearful Facebook posts, and called her a blessing sent from above. She lived alone in a modest but elegant home on Magnolia Street, drove a simple black sedan, and dressed in expensive but understated clothes. She spoke little, smiled less, and never discussed her past or the source of her wealth. When people asked, she would offer vague explanations about investments and inheritances, then quickly redirect the conversation by asking what they needed. And people always needed something. Margaret Nwosu had been the first to truly notice the pattern, though she didn't recognize it as one initially. Margaret worked as a receptionist at the community center where Grace often donated, and over the months, she developed a casual acquaintance with the mysterious benefactor. It started with small observations. The young couple who received money to avoid foreclosure suddenly stopped attending community events. The journalist who'd been investigating local corruption took a generous donation from Grace, and then abandoned his story entirely. The woman who'd threatened to expose a prominent businessman for assault received a substantial payment and moved to another city within days. Margaret mentioned these coincidences to her husband over dinner one evening, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling settling in her stomach. "Maybe they're just grateful," her husband said, not looking up from his plate. "Grace helps people move on with their lives." But move on from what? Margaret couldn't stop thinking about it. She began paying closer attention, keeping mental notes of who received Grace's generosity and what happened afterward. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every gift came with silence. Every favor had an unspoken price. And those who hesitated to accept were encouraged, sometimes insistently, to reconsider. 3 months after Samuel's disappearance, Margaret witnessed something that transformed her suspicion into certainty. She was working late at the community center when she heard raised voices from the parking lot. Through the window, she watched Grace speaking with David Obi, a young man who'd been vocal about suspicious activities in the neighborhood watch. Margaret couldn't hear the words, but she saw Grace hand David a thick envelope. She saw him refuse it, shaking his head adamantly. She saw Grace's pleasant expression harden into something else entirely, something cold and calculating. And then Grace leaned close and whispered something that made David's face drain of color. 2 days later, David accepted the money. A week after that, he stopped posting on social media. He stopped attending meetings. When Margaret saw him at the grocery store and tried to ask if he was all right, he looked at her with hollow eyes and said, "Just mind your business, Margaret. For your own good." The warning in his voice was unmistakable. Margaret went home that night and told her husband everything. He listened with growing alarm, then made her promise not to pursue it further. "That woman has money and influence," he said firmly. If what you're saying is true, she's dangerous. Please, Margaret. Let it go. But Margaret couldn't let it go. The question gnawed at her like a persistent ache. Where did Grace's money come from? Why did it come with such heavy strings attached? And what happened to people who tried to pull those strings? The answer began to reveal itself through Linda Okafor. Linda had been one of Grace's earliest beneficiaries in the community, a single mother struggling after a brutal divorce. Grace had appeared like an angel, offering money to help Linda start fresh, move to a better apartment, get her daughter into a good school. Linda had accepted gratefully, tearfully, calling Grace her savior. But when Margaret ran into Linda at the pharmacy, she barely recognized her. The vibrant, hopeful woman had transformed into a shell, thin and haunted, her hands trembling as she picked up a prescription for anxiety medication. Linda. Margaret approached cautiously. Are you okay? Linda's eyes darted around the pharmacy as if checking for watchers. I'm fine, she said mechanically. You don't look fine. Is there anything I can help with? Linda's composure cracked. Her eyes filled with tears, and she grabbed Margaret's arm with surprising strength. She owns me, Linda whispered. The money, it wasn't a gift. It was a chain. She knows things, Margaret. Things I did, things I'm ashamed of. She made sure I know she knows. And now I can't ever. Her voice broke completely. Before Margaret could respond, Linda released her arm and fled the pharmacy, leaving Margaret standing frozen among the aisles of medicine, her heart pounding. That night, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She would find out the truth about Grace Adeyemi, no matter what it cost. She started carefully, asking subtle questions of people who'd received Grace's help. Most refused to talk. Some became hostile when pressed. But a few, in quiet moments away from prying eyes and ears, admitted to feeling trapped. They spoke of obligations they didn't understand until after accepting the money. They described how Grace seemed to know their deepest secrets, their worst moments, their most vulnerable truths. And they all said the same thing. Once you took her money, you belonged to her. Margaret's investigation took a dramatic turn when she met Pastor Solomon Adelique. The pastor had recently retired and moved to a smaller congregation in a neighboring town. Margaret tracked him down after learning he'd been one of the few people to publicly refuse Grace's donation to his former church. The pastor invited her into his small home, his expression grave as she explained why she'd come. He listened in silence, then rose without a word and retrieved a folder from a locked drawer. I've been waiting for someone to ask these questions, he said, handing her the folder. I couldn't stay silent anymore, but I was too afraid to speak openly. This is everything I managed to find before I left. Margaret opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were bank statements, photocopied documents, printed emails, and handwritten notes. As she read, the room seemed to tilt around her. The scope of what Grace had built was staggering and sickening. Grace Adeyemi's money came from darkness. The documents revealed a sophisticated network of exploitation. Blackmail was her foundation. She would identify people with secrets, vulnerable people desperate for help, and offer them money. But the money came with strings. She would then use those people to gather information on others, building a web of compromised individuals who fed her intelligence and influence. There were records of stolen inheritances, money taken from elderly people through manipulation and forged documents. There were payments to traffickers, profits from moving desperate people across borders under false promises. There were accounts showing money laundered through legitimate businesses owned by people she controlled. Most horrifying were the notes about silencing. People who tried to expose her or simply refused to cooperate faced systematic destruction. Their businesses failed through mysterious circumstances. Their reputations were demolished by carefully planted rumors. Some, like Samuel Okonkwo, simply disappeared. She doesn't do the violence herself, Pastor Solomon explained quietly. She doesn't have to. She has enough money and enough compromised people to destroy anyone without lifting a finger. And because she's so generous publicly, no one questions her. Who would believe that the woman who paid for your child's surgery is actually a monster? Margaret felt sick. We have to expose her. We have to go to the police. The pastor's laugh was bitter. The police? Margaret, look at page 17. Margaret flipped through the documents and found what made her blood run cold. Payments to local officials. Officers, judges, even the police chief. Grace had bought protection at every level. Then what do we do? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. We gather more evidence. We find someone beyond her reach. And we pray we survive the process. Over the next 6 weeks, Margaret became someone she didn't recognize. She lied to her husband about where she was going. She met with Pastor Solomon in secret. Together, they carefully, painstakingly built a case that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. They tracked down people who'd been hurt by Grace's network. Some agreed to give statements if their identities could be protected. Others were too terrified. One woman, Rebecca Chukwu, provided detailed accounts of how Grace had blackmailed her into providing information about her employer, a respected businessman, which Grace then used to force him into laundering money through his company. I was drowning in debt, Rebecca told them, her voice hollow. Grace offered to pay it all off. I thought she was just being kind. Then she showed me photographs. Pictures of me from 10 years ago when I was desperate and did things I'm not proud of. She said no one ever had to know about those pictures if I just helped her with small favors. Small favors became bigger favors. And now I'm trapped in something terrible, and I don't know how to get out. Margaret recorded Rebecca's testimony on her phone, her hands steady even as her heart broke. This was what Grace did. She found people at their lowest, offered salvation, and then turned that salvation into a cage. They found others. Thomas Ease, whose construction company had been used to facilitate trafficking through fake labor contracts. Angela Madu, who'd been forced to forge documents at her government job. Michael Obi, David's older brother, who revealed that Grace had threatened David's entire family to ensure his cooperation. The evidence mounted. Financial records obtained from a Brave Bank employee who'd noticed suspicious patterns. Recorded phone calls where Grace's pleasant voice delivered threats disguised as advice. Testimonies from victims too broken to stay silent any longer. But as Margaret and Pastor Solomon worked, they began to notice signs that Grace knew. Cars that seemed to follow Margaret home from meetings. Strange calls that disconnected when answered. A break-in at the pastor's home where nothing was stolen but everything was carefully disturbed. The message was clear. Stop now or face consequences. Margaret's husband confronted her one evening. His face etched with fear and anger. You promised me you'd let this go. People are asking me about you. Someone told me they saw you meeting with that pastor. Margaret, please. I'm begging you. Whatever you're doing, stop before it's too late. Margaret looked at the man she loved and felt the weight of her choice. I can't stop, she said simply. Too many people have suffered. If I stop now, it continues forever. And if you don't stop, we might lose everything. Have you thought about that? Have you thought about our children? That's exactly who I'm thinking about, Margaret replied, her voice stronger than she felt. I'm thinking about the kind of world I want them to grow up in. One where people like Grace Adeyemi can't buy silence with blood money. Her husband stared at her for a long moment, then walked out of the room. The door to their bedroom closed with a finality that made Margaret's chest ache. But she couldn't stop now. She was too close. The breaking point came on a Wednesday afternoon. Margaret was at the community center, pretending to work while actually organizing her evidence, when Grace walked in. Their eyes met across the room, and Margaret felt ice spread through her veins. Grace approached slowly, her footsteps precise on the linoleum floor. She stood in front of Margaret's desk, removed her signature sunglasses, and revealed eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. Margaret Nwosu, Grace said softly. We need to talk. Margaret's mouth went dry. I'm busy right now. No, you're not. Grace pulled an envelope from her handbag and placed it on the desk. This is for you. $50,000. Consider it a thank you for all your hard work here at the community center. Margaret didn't touch the envelope. I don't want your money. Everyone wants my money, Margaret. That's what makes the world turn. Grace leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. I know what you've been doing. I know about the pastor. I know about the people you've been talking to. And I know about your husband's gambling problem that he thinks you don't know about. I know about your daughter's scholarship application, and how competitive it is. I know about your mother's memory care facility, and how expensive it's becoming. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Are you threatening me? I'm educating you, Grace replied, straightening. I'm showing you that I know everything about everyone. That's my gift. And I'm offering you a choice. Take the money, go home, and forget whatever foolish investigation you think you're conducting. Or refuse, and watch your comfortable little life disintegrate. Margaret stood, her legs trembling but her voice steady. I'm not taking your money. And I'm not stopping. Grace's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those cold eyes. Surprise perhaps. Or respect. You're braver than most, Margaret. Or more foolish. Time will tell which. She turned and walked toward the door, then paused. Without looking back, she said, Your husband's gambling debt is with some very unpleasant people. It would be a shame if they suddenly decided to collect. Think about that before you make your final decision. After Grace left, Margaret collapsed into her chair, shaking. The threat was explicit now. Grace would destroy her family to protect her secrets. Margaret had to move fast. That evening, Margaret and Pastor Solomon made copies of everything and sent packages to 3 different journalists in 3 different cities, along with federal investigators who operated outside local jurisdiction. They included a detailed letter explaining Grace's network, naming names, providing evidence, and making it clear that if anything happened to them, the story would still break. Then they waited. 2 days passed. Margaret barely slept, jumping at every sound. Her husband moved through the house like a ghost, not speaking to her. Her children asked why Mommy seemed scared. She told them everything would be okay, praying it was true. On the 3rd day, everything exploded. The federal investigators arrived at dawn, coordinating with state police to arrest Grace Adeyemi and 17 others involved in her network. The raids were swift and overwhelming. Evidence was seized from homes, offices, and safe deposit boxes. People were taken into custody before they could destroy records or flee. Grace was arrested at her home, still wearing a silk nightgown, her face finally showing emotion as agents read her rights. Shock, rage, and something else. Fear. The story broke on local news within hours and went national by evening. The scope of Grace's operation stunned everyone. Years of exploitation, blackmail, trafficking, and financial crimes were laid bare. Victims came forward once the dam broke, hundreds of them, each with stories of how Grace's money had become a trap. The community reacted with a mixture of shock, denial, and horror. Some refused to believe it. Grace had been so generous, so kind. How could someone who helped so many be so evil? But as more evidence emerged, as more victims spoke, the truth became undeniable. The woman they'd praised as a blessing had been a predator all along. Margaret watched the news coverage from her living room, feeling numb. Her husband sat beside her, his hand finding hers, squeezing gently. An apology and a thank you wrapped into one gesture. You did the right thing, he said quietly. I know, Margaret replied. But it doesn't feel good. Because it didn't. Yes, Grace would face justice. Yes, her victims would have a chance at freedom. But the damage was done. Lives had been ruined. People had suffered. And the community would carry the shame of their willful blindness for years to come. The trials began 6 months later. Grace Adeyemi faced 147 charges spanning fraud, blackmail, money laundering, human trafficking, and conspiracy. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Financial experts traced her money through dozens of shell companies and offshore accounts. Victims testified about years of exploitation and fear. Grace's defense was simple. She claimed she was a philanthropist whose generosity had been misunderstood. She suggested that disgruntled people were making up stories. She portrayed herself as a successful businesswoman being torn down by jealous neighbors. Nobody believed her. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on 132 counts. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered. Others wept. Grace's face remained impassive as the judge handed down a sentence of 45 years in federal prison. But even with Grace behind bars, the aftermath was complicated. Some of the people who'd been part of her network received lighter sentences in exchange for testimony. Others, like Thomas Ease and Angela Madu, faced their own criminal charges for the things they'd been forced to do under Grace's control. The moral lines weren't as clear as anyone wanted them to be. Yes, they'd been coerced and threatened. But they'd also participated in terrible things. Where did victimhood end and complicity begin? Linda Okafor, the single mother Margaret had encountered at the pharmacy, attended every day of the trial. When it ended, she approached Margaret outside the courthouse, her eyes clearer than they'd been in years. "Thank you," Linda said simply, "for being brave enough to ask questions, for not looking away." Margaret hugged her, feeling the weight of everything they'd all been through. "I'm sorry it took so long." "You did it when it mattered," Linda replied. "That's what counts." Not everyone saw it that way. Some in the community blamed Margaret for destroying Grace, for taking away their benefactor. They conveniently forgot what Grace had taken from others. They remembered only what she'd given them and resented Margaret for ending it. Margaret lost friends over it, received angry messages, had her tires slashed twice. But she also received messages of gratitude from people who'd been freed from Grace's control. Parents whose children Grace had helped, who now understood the cost of that help and wanted to make amends. Pastor Solomon Adeyemi returned to the community and held a special service 6 months after the trial. He spoke about complicity, about how evil flourishes when good people choose comfort over truth. The church was packed. Some people came to pray. Others came to find absolution for their silence. "We all saw the signs," the pastor said from the pulpit. "We all had moments of doubt. But Grace's money made our lives easier, so we chose not to question. We chose not to see. And that choice has consequences. Not just for us, but for everyone who suffered while we looked away." His words landed heavy in the sanctuary. Some people nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. But everyone listened. Margaret sat in the back pew, watching faces she'd known for years grapple with uncomfortable truths. This was the real aftermath of Grace's empire. Not just the criminal justice but the moral reckoning. The community had to face what they'd allowed, what they'd enabled, what they'd benefited from. Money without transparency is dangerous. Generosity without accountability is manipulation. And silence bought with cash always demands payment eventually. Those were the lessons carved into the community's consciousness now. Painful lessons learned through suffering and shame. A year after Grace's conviction, Margaret visited Samuel Okonkwo. She'd finally tracked him down in a small town 3 states away, living under a different name. When she knocked on his door, he answered with suspicion that melted into recognition. "Margaret? How did you find me?" "It took work," she admitted. "Can I come in?" They sat in his modest apartment, and Margaret told him everything that had happened. Samuel listened in silence, his expression cycling through emotions he couldn't quite name. "I knew," he said finally. "Not the details, but I knew something was wrong with her money. I could feel it, like it was stained somehow." He looked at his hands. "Refusing her cost me everything. My business, my reputation, my life here. But I'm still here. I survived." "You did more than survive," Margaret said. "You were the first person brave enough to say no publicly. You started something, even if you didn't know it." Samuel smiled sadly. "I'm not a hero, Margaret. I'm just a man who ran away." "You're a man who trusted his instincts," Margaret corrected. "That takes courage too." They talked for another hour, filling in pieces of a story that had consumed them both. When Margaret left, Samuel walked her to her car. "Will you come back?" he asked. "To the community?" Samuel looked toward the horizon, considering. "Maybe someday, when enough time has passed. When I can walk down those streets without feeling afraid." He turned back to her. "But not yet." Margaret understood. Some wounds needed time to heal. The community center created a memorial wall for Grace's victims. Names of people who'd been exploited, trafficked, silenced, or destroyed. It was a stark reminder of the cost of complicity. Margaret stood in front of it during the dedication ceremony, reading names of people she'd never met, but whose suffering had funded the community's comfort. Her daughter stood beside her, now old enough to understand what her mother had done and why. "Are you proud of yourself?" her daughter asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. Pride seemed like the wrong word. Relief, maybe. Satisfaction that justice had been done. But also sadness for everything that had been lost. "I'm proud that I didn't look away," Margaret finally answered. "I'm proud that when it mattered, I chose truth over comfort. That's all any of us can do." Her daughter nodded, absorbing this. Then she asked the question that hung over everything. Could it happen again? Could someone else like her come here? Yes, Margaret said honestly. Which is why we have to stay vigilant. Why we have to ask questions even when answers are uncomfortable. Why we can never let money blind us to suffering again. It was the hardest lesson but the most important one. Evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious malice. Sometimes it wears a kind face, speaks softly, and offers help when people are desperate. Sometimes it looks like generosity, feels like salvation, and sounds like blessing. Grace Adeyemi had understood this perfectly. She'd built an empire on people's reluctance to question their good fortune. She'd weaponized gratitude, turned charity into chains, and made silence a currency more valuable than cash. And she'd almost gotten away with it, because nobody wanted to believe that the woman who made their lives better could be making someone else's life unbearable. 2 years after Grace's conviction, Margaret received a letter. It came from the federal prison where Grace was serving her sentence, written in elegant handwriting on plain paper. Margaret almost threw it away unread. She didn't want to hear from Grace, didn't want whatever manipulation or justification the letter might contain. But curiosity won out. She opened it. The letter was short. Grace didn't apologize or justify her actions. Instead, she wrote something that chilled Margaret more than any threat could have. You think you've won, Margaret. You think putting me in prison solved the problem. But I was just one person who understood how the system works. There are others like me everywhere. People who see opportunity in desperation. People who know that everyone has a price. You can stop one person, but you can't stop what I represent. You can't stop human nature. People will always choose comfort over truth. They will always take the money and ignore where it comes from. I didn't create that. I just exploited it. And someone else will too. That's the real horror you should think about. Margaret burned the letter, but the words stayed with her. Because as much as she hated to admit it, Grace was partially right. The system that allowed her to flourish still existed. The desperate circumstances that made people vulnerable hadn't disappeared. The human tendency to look away from uncomfortable truths remained. But Grace was also wrong about something important. People could change. Communities could learn. And vigilance, while exhausting, was possible. Margaret thought about this as she drove past Grace's former house, now seized by the government and sold at auction. A new family lived there now, unaware of the darkness that had once resided within those walls. Maybe that was how it should be. New beginnings built on top of old nightmares. The community still struggled with its past. Town meetings now included strict transparency requirements for all donations and community funds. People were more skeptical of generosity that seemed too good to be true. And whenever someone offered help with no apparent strings attached, others asked the hard questions. Was it perfect? No. Were there still people who would rather not know where money comes from if it solved their immediate problems? Absolutely. But awareness had shifted. The comfortable ignorance that had allowed Grace to operate for years had been shattered. That was something. On the 3rd anniversary of Grace's arrest, the community held a remembrance service. Victims and their families gathered to share stories, support each other, and mark how far they'd come. Margaret attended, standing in the back, watching people find healing in shared trauma. Linda Okafor spoke about rebuilding her life without Grace's chains. David Obi talked about learning to trust again after years of fear. Rebecca Chukwu described the long process of forgiving herself for things she'd been coerced into doing. Their stories weren't neat or clean. Healing rarely is. But they were honest. And in that honesty there was power. As the service ended and people mingled, drinking coffee and sharing quiet conversations, Margaret felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Pastor Solomon, his face lined with age and experience but his eyes bright with purpose. "You did good work, Margaret," he said. "Real hard, important work." "We did it together," she corrected. "I couldn't have done it alone." "That's the point, isn't it?" the pastor mused. "One person standing up is brave. But when others join them, that's when change becomes possible." Grace understood that too in her twisted way. She built her empire by isolating people, making them think they were alone. "We defeated her by coming together." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight and wisdom of his words. "So what do we do now? How do we make sure it doesn't happen again?" "We remember," Pastor Solomon said simply. "We tell this story to our children and our children's children. We make sure everyone knows that money without transparency is dangerous. That generosity without accountability can be manipulation. That silence bought with cash always costs more than anyone expects to pay. He gestured to the people gathered in the hall, survivors and supporters mixed together in complicated solidarity. And we built something better. Community that asks questions. That demands truth. That values justice more than comfort. It's harder than the old way. It's less comfortable. But it's right. As Margaret drove home that evening, she thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the investigation, the revelations, the trials, the aftermath. She thought about Samuel Okonkwo, who'd been the first to say no. About Linda Okafor, who'd survived to tell her story. About all the people who'd found the courage to speak up once someone else did first. And she thought about Grace Adeyemi, sitting in a prison cell, still probably believing she'd only been caught, not wrong. That was perhaps the saddest part of all. Grace would likely never understand the magnitude of harm she'd caused. Never truly grasp that people weren't just assets to be leveraged or problems to be solved with money. When Margaret arrived home, her family was waiting. Her husband had cooked dinner. Her children had set the table. They ate together, talking about their days, sharing small joys and minor complaints. Normal life, earned through extraordinary courage. Later, as Margaret tucked her youngest child into bed, her daughter asked, "Mom, are we safe now? Is the bad lady gone forever?" Margaret brushed hair from her daughter's forehead, choosing her words carefully. Grace is in prison, yes. But safety isn't just about one person being gone. Safety comes from people being brave enough to ask questions and speak truth, even when it's scary. From communities that protect each other. From never letting money make us forget what matters. Like you did, her daughter said simply. Like I tried to do, Margaret corrected. And like I hope you'll do if you ever need to. The world needs people who won't look away from hard truths. Her daughter considered this with the seriousness only children can muster. Then nodded. Okay, I'll try. Margaret kissed her forehead. That's all any of us can do. As she turned off the light and closed the door, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not quite peace, but something close to it. Acceptance, maybe. Understanding that the work of building a better world is never finished. But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. The horrifying secrets about Grace's money weren't just about where it came from, or how it was used. The real horror was how easily people accepted it. How desperately they wanted to believe in simple generosity. How readily they traded their questions for comfort. That was the lesson that mattered most. The one that needed to echo beyond this community, beyond this story. Because Grace Adeyemi wasn't unique. The circumstances that created her weren't rare. And the temptation to look away from uncomfortable truths in exchange for material comfort exists everywhere. Always. So the story couldn't end with Grace's arrest or conviction. It had to end with a challenge. A question posed not just to the people in this community, but to everyone who hears this tale. When money appears in your life without clear explanation, do you ask where it came from? When someone's generosity seems too perfect, do you question their motives? When accepting help means staying silent about wrongdoing, do you have the courage to refuse? These aren't easy questions. The answers come with costs. Samuel Okonkwo lost everything before being vindicated. Margaret risked her family and safety for truth. Everyone who stood up paid a price. But the alternative, the cost of silence and complicity, is always higher. It's just paid by someone else. Someone vulnerable. Someone desperate. Someone whose suffering funds someone else's comfort. Grace Adeyemi knew this. She built an empire on it. And somewhere out there, others are doing the same thing right now, counting on people to choose comfort over truth. The question is, what will you do when faced with that choice? Will you take the money and look away? Will you ask the hard questions even when answers are frightening? Will you stand up when standing up costs something? The answer to that question determines not just individual character, but the kind of world we all live in. A world where Grace Adeyemi's flourish, or a world where they're stopped before they can destroy hundreds of lives. Margaret Nwosu made her choice. She chose truth over comfort, justice over safety, courage over complicity. It cost her friendships, peace of mind, and years of her life. But it also saved countless people from continued exploitation, and showed a community that change is possible when ordinary people refuse to stay silent. That's the real ending to this story. Not neat, not comfortable, but honest. A reminder that evil doesn't just exist in the hearts of monsters like Grace. It exists in every moment we choose not to see, not to question, not to act. And it's defeated not through grand heroic gestures, but through ordinary people doing the hard, uncomfortable work of demanding truth and standing up for what's right. So if you found this story compelling, if it made you think or question or consider your own choices, that's good. Share it. Talk about it. Let it spark conversations about transparency, accountability, and the true cost of money that comes with unspoken strings. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Would you have taken Grace's money? Would you have questioned where it came from? Would you have had the courage to refuse, to investigate, to stand up? Be honest. The question isn't meant to judge, but to provoke thought. And if this story resonated with you, if you think others need to hear it, subscribe to this channel. Because stories like this matter. They remind us that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences. That courage doesn't mean being unafraid. It means acting despite fear. That the work of building a just world never ends, but it's always worth doing. The horrifying secrets about Grace's money have been revealed, but the lessons they teach are ongoing, challenging, and necessary. Don't look away from them. Don't let comfort make you complicit. And never forget that silence, like money, always comes with a price. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for caring enough to hear it through. Now go forward and remember. Question the money that seems too good to be true. Stand up when others are being silenced. Be the person who asks hard questions even when answers are uncomfortable. Be the Margaret in your community. Be the Samuel who says no to blood money. Be the person who refuses to trade truth for comfort. Because somewhere, right now, another Grace Adeyemi is counting on people to stay silent. Don't give her that satisfaction. Speak up. Question. Act. And together, maybe we can build a world where horrifying secrets can't hide behind generous smiles and blood money.